We are moving on to the second half of that OET Reading Part C text. If you didn't see Part 1, go back to that previous video in the playlist just above this that you can find those first 4 questions. Let's jump right into our next one. So here we have a numbers question. What do the figures provided in the 4th paragraph reveal? I have to say, I personally love number questions because I feel you can pretty confidently go to the section of the paragraph that they're asking you about. So you go to the numbers, you look at what they're saying, and then you draw a conclusion from it. So the approach to these number questions tends to remain quite similar across our texts. So pause the video, read the text, look at your options, select the best answer, and when you're ready, we'll go through that explanation together. All right, so even though the question here is on the figures, it's still good to read the whole paragraph. So let's take a look here. So how might diagnostic error be reduced? So the first problem is disclosure. So often the first couple sentences can give us a clue as to what they're trying to get at with the specific examples. As without openness, the problem cannot be tackled. Surveys suggest that an overwhelming majority of practitioners agree that serious errors should be disclosed to patients. Okay, yet while in one study, 47% of pathologists questioned had been involved with a serious error, only 17% had actually disclosed a serious error to the patient. All right, so when you first look at that, you might think, I'm focusing on the difference between the 47% and the 17%, and that is part of it. But don't forget, numbers and figures can also be represented in language form. So words like the overwhelming majority of practitioners agree, that also kind of gets at the number or the amount, right? So here we have clearly the system prevents doctors from being as transparent as they would wish. Why should this be? So if I'm looking at, okay, the overwhelming majority agree that you should disclose it. So let's put a check mark. They think, yes, that's a good thing to do. Now in this study, they questioned 47% and only 17 had actually done it. So what are we seeing here? Well, we're seeing this difference between what people think they should do and what is good to do. And then of course, with our 17%, that is reflecting what actually happened in reality. Now, of course, with that, we can see the discrepancy, right, between what we think. A lot of people think you should do it, but how many people actually do it? So when we're looking there, that should immediately point out that large discrepancy or difference. This part in A, right? There is a gap between doctors' intentions, or what we see here, the language. They should be disclosed to patients. That's what they're viewing, versus the actions. In reality, the word actually, what have they actually disclosed? So often with the word intentions, you're looking at what people think is good or what should be done or what is likely a good thing, right? And the reality of the actions is, yeah, very few people actually did that. So hopefully you can see that gap is represented there. All right, and then if we look at our other options here, so it is unclear why some types of errors remain so underreported. Well, they do point here, why should this be, right? Like, what is the reason? But go back to the question again, what do the figures reveal? Not so much what is other things in the paragraph saying. So we have to be careful. B doesn't actually answer the question about the figures. C, many doctors don't believe it is necessary to report medical error. So this one we can pretty clearly rule out because it says the majority agree that serious errors should be disclosed. So that's almost a direct piece of negative evidence there. And then D, the rates of medical errors vary considerably across different fields. Well, the only field we're given here is with pathologists, right? So this could be different in other fields, maybe, but based on what we're given, we have no comparison there. So hopefully you see that this is a very clear pointing to A with our numbers specifically. All right. Some of our OET Reading Part C texts will have figure questions and others won't. So when you get one, I usually suggest that sort of approach, looking for what is the difference between these numbers and what is it pointing to as well. Okay, here's your next one. So in the 5th paragraph, the writer praises the airline industry for. All right, so be careful with this one. Pause the video, take a read, choose your answer. And as you're looking, you really want to focus on the praise. What action specifically, or what item are they praising? Once you're ready, we'll start. Okay, so let's start. Look at our options here. So presenting errors to the public in a way that can be readily understood, option A. Option B, allowing those who acknowledge mistakes to remain anonymous. Okay, so those who acknowledge mistakes, making sure that all employees are aware of the risk factors, or paying pilots in a way that is not linked to performance. So my question for you is, with this one, did you have difficulty deciding between two options? If you did, that is totally normal. This is a kind of question where two of the options you can pretty clearly eliminate. And then there's two options where it's a very close, careful reading that is required. So let's take a look here. So what do we see in here? We see talk about reputation, our instinct being to keep quiet, and then fearing one's actual livelihood, talking about things being posted on the internet, and just highlighting kind of key phrases here in each sentence. And just talking about in cultures where physicians' payment is based on a fee-for-service system, compare this with the airline industry. So this is really what we're focusing on, although we may need other details in the previous sections there. So let's erase some of that. So here we go. Compare this with the airline industry. It gives pilots a medal for admitting that they had a near miss because it helps everyone to understand where the risks are. Okay, so a couple of things. We're seeing reflective language here, right? So immediately I'm looking at C, making sure that all employees are aware of risk factors. That seems pretty reflective of that. But again, what is the writer praising the airline industry for? So let's keep reading. What's more, there's no risk to the pilot's job because the near misses aren't publicized per person. So here we have a situation where they've stated two positive things in this, in this sentence here. Helping everyone to understand the risk, that's a benefit, and also the fact that they're not publicized. There is much to be said for this approach. Okay? So here's what's tricky. When we're looking there, we can eliminate two, but we have to carefully read for the other two. So paying pilots in a way that is not linked to performance. There's really no mention in there. Pilots are being, not assessed or not, it's not connected in that way between their job performance and the money they make. So D, we can rule out. Presenting errors to the public in a way that can be readily understood. Well, we did see mention of, what did we see in there? Just sort of being posted on the internet and whatnot, but this is really not specific to the airline industry example. So we want to be focusing in that and what we see there. Good. Now here's what's tricky. We really have to look at the language, and I would say it's not a lot that differentiates B from C. But look in here. It gives pilots a medal for admitting that they had a near miss because it helps everyone to understand where the risks are. Okay? And then what else do we have? There's no risk to the pilot's job because the near misses aren't publicized per person. So a couple of clues here. One is, when we look at the language here, they aren't publicized per person. That is pointing to an anonymity, right? So remaining anonymous as well. And then specifically, the actual action. What are the airlines doing? Okay. Well, they are allowing them, right? They are saying to them, there aren't going to be consequences if you report it. So they're allowing them, they're also rewarding it with a medal as well. There is much to be said for this approach. So when you think of the approach, like what is it that the airlines are actively doing versus, what's the result? So what we saw with the consequences and the risks, it helps everyone understand where the risks are. That's a result. That's a benefit that comes from allowing them to report and also giving them a medal and whatnot. So allowing them to report these mistakes so that everyone can learn. So be careful with actions that are actively done versus results. So our answer here is pointing to B because they are actually allowing or creating it. Now the airlines, they aren't necessarily, informing for no reason all the employees. It's a result of the fact that because these mistakes are admitted, therefore everybody, becomes aware of it. So that's really tricky. And I think, again, the key word in here, this approach. So the approach, meaning they are actually being active about it, allowing that to happen. And we see that is what he's saying is a good thing, right? And contrasting it to the not good thing that's happening in the first few sentences where everyone is assessing what will happen if I do disclose this information. Let me know if you need more clarification on that. That's a very nuanced difference between B and C about, again, the activeness versus what is the result of it or what happens after that. All right, number 21. We're looking here at another lexical reference question. Now this one's different. Our previous one in the last video, we had counterintuitive, and that's a lexical reference in the sense that it is a vocabulary word we're using. Here we have a cohesive device. So the word this is going to connect things together. We should also be able to replace this with one of our 4 options. That is the answer. So pause the video, read through it, and go ahead there. All right, so what do we have? Let's take a look there. We have 4 options. So a private conversation, postponing a decision, speaking to senior staff, and passing the problem on. Okay, so there's nuance, there's differences between those. Let's take a look at the sentence that has this word, but this. So usually, if it's a connector, we have to look at the previous sentence. So let's go back. Generally, they pick option 1 as risk management is their absolute last choice. Okay, so we're building here. This points back to the previous sentence. Option 1, we have to go back further to find out what is option 1. They are faced with the option of talking to the physician at fault themselves. So that is number 1. Or going to the institution's risk management office. Option 2. Okay, so then let's go back to the very beginning to make sure we have this context. Even in situations where a doctor wasn't responsible for the error, it can still be difficult for them to disclose when that comes to their attention. So they have 2 options. They can talk directly to the physician, or they can go to the institution's risk management option. Next sentence, then they usually pick option 1, which is talking directly to the physician at fault, as risk management is their absolute last choice. But this, okay, so notice here, we are tracing it back and all the way back to where we see number 1 there. We're still talking about this, right? This conversation with the physician at fault themselves can contribute to errors remaining hidden. And if we think logically, well, because, as it says, it leaves the choice of how to proceed with the physician at fault. Okay? In contrast, if you go to the institution's risk management office, I'm sure they'd have a different approach for addressing it, right? So really, it's just about tracing it back. And if we look at our options, speaking to senior staff, well, no, we're having a direct conversation with the physician at fault. Passing the problem on, No, right? We're talking directly to them. We're not going to the institution's risk management officer. Postponing a decision, no. I mean, it could happen immediately or later. We have no information there about when that happens. It's this private conversation, right, between you and this physician at fault. So hopefully you follow that. This is often the way with the word this. We can follow all the way back to an actual noun. So the physician at fault themselves, or noun phrase, we should be able to put that in. So this option of, if we look at the full thing, this option of talking to the physician at fault themselves can contribute to errors remaining hidden. We should see that that whole thing can substitute for that. Good. And then unsurprisingly, given the disclosure disincentives outlined above, sometimes the error report goes no further. So we see that that nicely concludes it. Does everyone see that? Let me know if you didn't in the comments below and I can add a little bit more there. But it is this, what we call rabbit trail. You go back to the previous sentence. If there's another reference one, like option 1, you go back to the previous one and you just keep going until you get to what is this thing that everybody's referencing here. All right. And finally, we have, what conclusion does the writer come to about the fear of litigation? So pause the video, read through the text, choose the option that you think best answers that. All right, so let's take a look at this one. So first thing, we are focused on specifically about the fear of litigation. So don't let other aspects of the text distract you from that. All right. So we have right at the start talking about this concept, so the fear of litigation. And then what else does he say? So lots in there about, so this concept, deny and defend the status quo. Okay. From the patient perspective, so flipping it, deny and defend has been said to be slow, inequitable, and inefficient. From the physician perspective, so okay, we have different things happening here being addressed, but we're still looking for specifically the conclusion. Often with the word conclusion, not always, but frequently, you can look for it towards the end where he gets to laying out those examples and details and then coming into land on the main point here. Good. So what do we have here? In fact, most physicians have a very powerful moral compass and don't need fear of litigation to drive their behavior in the right direction. Then he goes in to specify. So for example, and he gives this example of the survey, disclosure rates were identical, even in these two countries where there's different litigation environments. So often as well around examples, you can kind of see an introduction statement of why he's giving this example, and then a concluding statement to reinforce the point. Perhaps then the litigation environment merely acts as a general stressor, which contributes to an environment of non-disclosure, but only drives, so look at our actions, our verbs as well here, drives non-disclosure in particular circumstances. So lots of language here about maybe it's not specific, maybe it's general, maybe it's only in particular situations that this is happening. So what are we seeing here? Well, we're seeing originally he's talking about the fear of litigation and going into those details. And then he's kind of backtracking on it and he's introducing, well, actually, physicians, many have a very powerful moral compass, and look at this language, don't need fear of litigation to drive their behavior in the right direction. So originally he comes out kind of strong with the fear of litigation, and then he goes and says, well, actually there's other things that are driving behaviors. Maybe they don't need it as much. That should be pointing you to C, right? It is less of an issue than might be expected. Well, why? Well, because he's saying for many, it's actually the moral compass which is dictating that. And then later after that example, maybe he's saying it's just a general stressor. It's not actually, always the reason that non-disclosure is happening. Now, if we eliminate options here, it has had some positive impact on how doctors practice. Well, let's take a look there. You know, the whole point here is the problem of non-disclosure due to, the risks. What is having a positive impact possibly is the moral compass, right, that he introduces rather than the fear of litigation. But in this case, we're not really seeing that the fear of litigation itself is creating a positive benefit overall. It is more of a problem for patients than doctors, so we have to look in there carefully. It looks like, again, the patients are saying it's slow, inequitable, and inefficient. The physicians are saying it's expensive, stressful, and inclined to incentivize defensive medicine. So it sounds like nobody from that is having a good benefit from that. It sounds like it's problematic for both patients and doctors for different reasons. So be careful, words like more, words like less, we have to read carefully, is that what's being stated, or is it just, actually it's a problem for both, but for different reasons. And then it drives some doctors out of the profession. So what do we have there? The avoidance of high-risk patients or procedures. We have indication that maybe it affects their behavior and that they're less likely to do things. But actually, leaving medicine altogether, well, I don't see anything in there that's suggesting or is concluding especially that. I mean, if there's enough stress, maybe, but again, we're looking at the details. Specifically, is the fear of litigation causing that? And there's not strong evidence there from what is written. So we see from that process, it is less of an issue than might be expected. That's, again, where we're getting at with our examples and our specific details there. All right. That's a little bit trickier, and that one would take more time on the OET test, and we do see that. Some questions are a little more obvious to find the answer, some take more careful analysis, so you want to keep that in mind when you are practicing the timing of the exam, how much time to give yourself for each question. And actually, that is something as well that we will be talking about in my upcoming masterclass for parts A, B, and C of reading with the OET. A lot of what you need to learn is strategies, but also tips and tricks can also mean time management or on the computer, what tools can you use for the exam? All these sort of things are important to be aware of before you actually go into test day for the OET. So if you haven't already, sign up for my upcoming masterclass on March 10th. It is 2 hours and it's online, and I'm providing a 20% discount for those who have found me through YouTube. You can enter YouTube 20% at checkout, and that will give you a discount on the 2-hour masterclass. And I just want to encourage you, if you haven't already seen my previous Part B and Part C videos, go back to them because we have lots of examples, strategies, seeing how the texts are reflecting the language and everything like that. If you haven't subscribed, make sure to do so because up next, we're moving on to listening. Specifically, we're going to start with listening part C, and we're going to go backwards, starting with C, then going to B, then going to A for that. And if you struggle with reading part C, my guess is you might struggle as well with listening part C. So subscribe, hit that notification bell so that when I next release the listening videos, you will know and you can practice along with me.